I was just saying we got a question in, if anybody wants to tackle it, from Joe. Does faith require protest? And are there examples of faith without protest?
Again, might need a couple of minutes, right?
I could give my 2 cents on it, just personally first, and let you guys think about it for a minute. Personally, for me, where I'm coming from, I can't see my faith without protest. Not sort of, protesting against anybody that disagrees with me. I just mean that when I look at the person of Jesus, I don't see someone who conforms to societal oppression. I see someone who calls it out. And at least when I see other faiths, I see this, if we're going to look at how faiths emerged, maybe in a more secular way, faiths kind of have this common thing where it's like looking after the little guy. And that's a big generalization. But at least most faiths that I know at least comprehend that there is someone who has it worse than us, and we have a duty to them to do better. And I think that while there are examples of how to do this without protest, that's sort of an individual way to that. From my point of view, that's a very individual way to solve a much more macro problem, which is systemic. And protest at least allows us to break down these systems that hold people in oppressive regimes, like, for example, the fact that women weren't allowed to vote, weren't allowed to work and stuff like that. Suffragettes allowed us to do all that, although there could be lots to do to allow women to maybe have more say in the house. There was a need for a complete structural change in that sort of example. But I'd love to hear your points of view also.
I agree. Oh, sorry.
I'm so sorry, Josh. No, go ahead. I'll go after you.
Okay. I'll give my 2 cents, as Joanne said. I think I agree. Protest as it in a way that it's just faith is something different, but they work together. So, like, as I said, I grew up in a liberal synagogue, and I struggled. It was interesting because because I have a mixed family, it took me quite a while to realize that I wanted to be Jewish. I wanted to have a bar mitzvah, etc. And for a while, I struggled to kind of work out how my faith would fit different things I believed in, like equality for women and so on, because, every community does struggle with this. But I was lucky because the community I came into was so liberal and open-minded that the rabbi happened to be a woman, which to some people may seem like not much at all, but it was a huge change to some of the synagogues where members of my family had bar mitzvahs, where men and women were separated. And while I kind of, I didn't feel comfortable there, I let them do their thing, but I wanted to go somewhere where the religion did meet my social values, and in that sense my faith was a protest. Like, the fact that I joined the synagogue was a protest, and it was like showing that faith communities can change and they can make that difference. So
I loved what you said, and I think it's so important to have those. I mean, I'm not Jewish, but I can definitely say, as a person of faith who belongs to, like a community of faith, it's so nice to have those examples of people where it's different and you feel like we're moving forward, and that's really nice. And I had 2 things to say. One thing is a very general comment, since I think, at least this may not relate to every religion, but I think of the religions that we all subscribe to here, one thing that I've always found fascinating is that each of our religions were established with struggle. And I feel like that there was a spirit of protest, or a spirit of going against the status quo, or spirit of liberation that needed to happen in order to establish each of those religions. And so I think that from the beginning, that spirit was already there. And once we become organized communities, the religion will, of course, develop. But there was always that spark that is needed. And I think that that is very powerful. And specifically in my religion, there's, I'll just very quickly narrate a very definitive moment in like very early Islamic history. This is probably 50 or so years after the Prophet's death. And you have an instant where his own grandson, and so his grandson, his family, is massacred by the Muslim ruler. At that time, there was quite an empire, and he was massacred by the Muslim ruler. And this was a very shocking event to have the Prophet's own grandson treated like this. And it's a very definitive moment and very important for all Muslims in different ways. The event is interpreted in many different ways, but one way that people see it as is his grandson Hussein had to sacrifice himself for both the sake of the faith, to keep it alive because it had been corrupted in those 50 short years after his grandfather's death, but also for the sake of earthly justice. And he had to oppose the ruler, even though the odds were stacked against him. And by doing so, the tyranny that was, lying beneath this, glorious Islamic empire needed to be exposed to everybody. And so it's always a struggle. And so for me, to answer the question, does faith require protest? I think it definitely does.
I love everything I'm hearing. I totally agree. And I think for me, I often personally reflect on what protest means, because protest can mean very different things and manifest itself in different ways. And to your point, Sarah, the beginnings of faith, I was thinking the exact same thing. So many faiths, not just out of the Abrahamic traditions, but I'm thinking of the monks during Vietnam that set themselves on fire, and other protests that exist. There's just different types of protests and different ways that faiths compel people to act on the values to demonstrate their commitment to their worldview and who they are, but also to demonstrate to the world what's going on and bring a kind of a message of something's not right here, and I need to act on it, and my faith is calling me to act on it. But I also think, as I think about the work that we do with students, very rarely do we have just a student on a campus that is doing something for interfaith engagement. They generally have a team, or they're working with a mentor, a faculty advisor, and that differences of faith, but also differences of personality, allow for kind of the movement of the protest to grow in different ways. And I'll often do a workshop where we kind of do an asset mapping, where we talk about just the ripples of impact that individuals have. And while I might have a set of ripples that emanate from me in my work and in my community, you standing 2 feet next to me are going to have different ripples and impact people different ways. And so how we work together to protest, whether we come from a similar worldview and faith or not, allows for messages to be heard differently, and allows for the faith to even be seen differently, so that it's not just Brian as a Catholic, it's other Catholics or other individuals that are demonstrating their faith around a core issue or core concern, like feminism, as you were saying. Like, how are these people of different backgrounds still coming to the same conclusion or coming to a space of common ground? And I think that's where the impact of interfaith cooperation is so critical to protest, right? Because it's showing that it's not just one side or another side. It's that there's multiple people experiencing a struggle and acting out in a similar way, maybe not the exact same, but a similar way.
I think it's really nice how you all mentioned different kinds of protest as well. So for example, like Josh said, even being in a certain space in itself can be an act of protest. Even engaging with other perspectives, like you're saying, Brian, can be an act of protest as well. in many ways. So it's interesting how we can take that into our daily lives, not just in kind of the more traditional forms of, going out into the street or making a post, I think, as Joe mentioned, on social media, but actually just engaging with this on a daily personal level.
Sorry, I have one more thing to say. Sorry, I feel like I'm talking too much on this question, but I also think it's important to remember that protests need different people. So you need someone at the front of the crowd or the front of the march, but you also need people back, making sure people get fed and are keeping the spirit alive, not just being the kind of the person at the podium. And I think that's another piece where the values of a faith, what if a worldview compels you to do, manifest as well. Because I think, just thinking of Jesus, there's definitely times in the Gospels where we read about Jesus stepping up and talking to the crowd, but then there's also the time where he's quietly washing the feet of his companions or helping people out and feeding the crowds with the loaves and fishes story. And so to paint one person in as one protester or one type of another protester is, I think, doing a disservice to our history and the richness of the traditions we come from, but also does a disservice to the many skills and traits that we all have to be the leaders that we need to be. Because if we're only leaning into one skill or one aspect of our leadership, then we're not being fully human and fully expressive of what we can contribute. And so obviously we have the skills that we're good at, and I'm not saying like try and force yourself to be a leader in another way, but as the three of you with coexistence work together, like you demonstrate clearly different aspects of worldviews, but also personalities to bring a richness to the larger protest that you may be a part of, just as an example.
I really like what you said about like protest, about creating society and creating community and a multifaceted community. I definitely, when I think of especially through like a liberation theology lens, it seems that like that's often it paints my worldview, a liberation theology sort of idea perspective, how protest can then impact a wider societal reading of faith and how we value one another as intrinsic parts of this machine to help other people. And I think that's really amazing, honestly. I don't really have much of a reflection other than that. I just found that really inspiring.
I think it's beautiful. I think that interfaith solidarity can. Oh, sorry, Josh, were you going to say something?
No. I was going to say thanks, but you.
Lagging, yeah. No, then I think that the interfaith solidarity can play a very large part in that, as well, of that enriching of each other. So, for example, here in our small community in Trondheim, I believe it was in 2015 when there was a terrorist attack on the synagogue in Copenhagen. And when that happened, local Muslim communities, both in Trondheim and in the other Jewish community in Oslo, stood around the synagogue and held hands in protection of it and in solidarity between two minorities in the country. And in a similar way, last summer, when there was a terrorist attack on a mosque in Oslo, we stood outside the mosque during their Friday prayer to show solidarity with them. So I think it's really beautiful how, just how interfaith can be a part of this solidarity.